Welcome to the History Bards podcast today. I'm host Dee Marley, and we are welcoming historical fiction author Jules Larimore to the show today. As an author of emotive, literary-leaning historical fiction bringing past cultures to life, Jules' mantra is to impart hopeful human stories that are not only entertaining, but also inspire positive change and encourage an intimate relationship with the natural environment. In her writing, she adds a dose of magic, myth, and romance, distilled and blended with captivating settings, bucolic hamlets set in majestic mountains and dramatic river gorges, rolling plains, seaside ports, rustic inns, exquisitely crafted chateaux, flamboyant soirees, colorful markets and fetes, mysterious carvings and symbology, and ancient menhirs and dolmens. These all come together as inspirational backdrops for the journeys of those who had the courage, tenacity, and transcendent vision to overcome oppression and danger arising from greed in the name of the church, the ruler, and the traditions. She tells stories of divisions, rivalries, and love, of hard choices and hard lessons learned. But over the 20 years ago, she decided she would write about her eighth great-grandfather, who was a French Huguenot. When health challenges made it necessary to quit her 60 to 80-hour-a-week job, she chose to look at it as a blessing and was able to focus her efforts on the novel and series. And we are so thrilled that we had the opportunity to review the Muse of Freedom, and we are so glad to have you on the show today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
That's great. Well, to get started, I know I want to know, and I know our listeners want to know about your journey as a writer. I know I kind of mentioned that in the intro, but can you tell us a little bit more about what led you to write historical fiction?
Well, it wasn't my first career choice.
Okay.
Had I known I could jump right in and make a living at it, I probably would have. But I just always have loved history and historical fiction, primarily of the Middle Ages and Renaissance periods.
Yeah.
And especially Arthurian legends. So when I went to university, or college, as we call it here, I took some medieval studies classes, which I really enjoyed. But then my other interests were so broad. I liked anthropology and archaeology and architecture and marketing, and I took some narrative composition classes. But so I ended up with a Bachelor of Arts degree, this general degree. And I started a career actually in design, which later, now that I think about it, it actually contributed to my writing abilities because we had to study the principles of balance, proportion, rhythm, emphasis, and unity. And I'm like, well, we do that in historical fiction.
Right.
And then later on, I switched to a marketing position, and that kind of offered an outlet for creative writing too, because I used it to, I did a lot of writing to romance brands. And then I've also over the years done a fair amount of nonfiction narrative writing for magazines and online portals, especially in the eco-friendly tourism sector.
Okay.
So travel writing. And then, as you mentioned, about 3 years ago, I ended up having some health challenges. So I couldn't work full time. And there was my opportunity to finally sit down and write a book that I had in me for over 20 years. So I took some master classes and some lots of workshops, and did that for a couple of years. And then now I work weekly with a really fantastic critique partner who many people listening might really know her. It's Janet Workman, who writes Tudor fiction. Okay. And then lo and behold, finally after 3 years, I had a novel finished. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's always interesting to hear about authors' journeys and how they come to the decision to write historical fiction, how it kind of led them there. But we would love to know more about, can you tell us a little bit more about the book, the Muse of Freedom, and also the series?
Yeah. Well, the series itself, I call the Seminole Sagas. it's based on the people from, it's a little known cultural region in the Seven Mountains in South Central France. And the Muse of Freedom is the first in a trilogy of 3 stories inspired by the true story of Jehan BonDurant, who is my 8th great grandfather. And but I'm also developing some novels for later after the trilogy that are female characters based in the same region, but further back in time. I'm going to do Azalès de Toulouse in the 12th century and Annemie, a Merovingian princess from the 7th century.
Oh, okay.
Those are, I've already been working on the research for those.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the research that you did and about your grandfather and how that developed?
Yeah, I had some genealogy that my uncle had done, about 25 years ago. And that led me to find a historian who had put together some books actually on Jehan BonDurant, and just charted all the primary source material that she had located. And then I dove in a little bit deeper because I started finding some of the genealogy to be conflicting. Some genealogists had written some things back in the 30s, and some misinformation got perpetuated through the years.
Yeah.
And fortunately, with Ancestry.com and GeniaNet is actually the equivalent to Ancestry, but in France. And there I was able to connect with the French BonDurant cousins and find some other details. For instance, in the story, I don't know if you recall that Jean-Pierre's father they mentioned that he was imprisoned for about a month in the dungeon. So that was new information that I had found along the way. The primary, I wanted to get to primary sources, and fortunately in France, they have a lot of things digitized. They have the archives, the government archives and things like that. And also one of the priors at the Dominican priory in this town had collected all of the old documents from the 13th century on.
Oh,
and
wow.
gathered. Yeah, so that was really helpful too.
Yes.
A really nice treasure to run across.
So you got to actually go there. You got to travel.
Yeah, I've actually, I've been to France about 4 times, but I got to go to this particular region twice. And I do have an interesting story about the last time I was there.
Tell us.
So the townhouse that was owned by Jehan BonDurant, I connected with the current owner, and he very graciously took me on a tour of the house. And it's, in an old medieval village. Streets are really narrow, even though he lived on La Grande Rue. It was the big main street, but you could barely get a car down it. But he took me on a tour of the house and told me some of the history. The house originally dates from the 13th century, and then there had been some additions onto it. And he showed me that there was this area in the salon, what we think of as a living room, during the height of Louis XIV's persecutions, where the BonDurant family added built-in cabinetry along the walls that actually contained a secret passage.
Oh.
That passage was used by the Huguenot pastors that would come to the house for their clandestine prayer meetings, their secret prayer meetings. So that was really fascinating to know that.
Oh, absolutely. I love whenever you find like little obscure things that you can add to but it goes beyond adding it to your stories, because especially as being your family, that it really adds something to knowing that about them is
right.
Yeah, I really love finding out those kind of things. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. Do you have a favorite line or passage from your own book that you would like to share?
I do. I've got a lot of favorite passages.
I understand.
Yeah. There's one that I just find kind of a joyful passage that Yeah, so this is when he goes to visit Amelia, who's the fictitious female protagonist, and her grandmother is Menina, that is a grandmother in Occitan. So this is a passage where he's going to visit her again. Jean stepped out of the rear door of Menina's house onto the granite stoop. It was a simple entrance to the modest gardens, yet in his mind, the welcome was as grand as any entree to Versailles. A frog trumpeted with bellows and croaks as birds of splendid colors fluttered about or sat on the Plessis fence, performing their lavish melodies. The beds wore a wealth of spring flowers and herbs and cool weather vegetables, like the threads of a courtier's emerald brocade gown weaving in and around each other. It took a moment to spot Amelia on her knees amongst the profusion of plant life around her. She wore no veil, her light chestnut hair tied up at the nape of her neck with a few strands binding down beside her face. Such a gentle gardener, she had transformed the plots so that the native vines and greenery now cradled the ordered rows. Wild parts, tame parts, chaos, and rhythm, all in one beautiful system.
Oh, that's so lovely. And again, that's one of the reasons why we gave your book 5 stars.
Yeah, I don't know if you can tell I'm a nature lover.
Oh, yes, you can. And it's very beautiful prose, very beautiful. So now that you've shared with us something that you really enjoyed from your own book, what did you find most difficult about writing this book?
Well, my inability to speak or read French fluently is the biggest challenge. Yeah, and when I needed to sort through some of those errors in the genealogy, I'm like, okay, now I know I have to go to primary sources. And I also wanted to deep dive into the socio-political, everything that was going on during the era, customs and traditions. And so I did spend a lot of time on primary sources, and thank goodness for Google Translate and DeepL.
Yes.
That really helped me a lot.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Well, I know a lot of authors start out as young, and there's a lot who listen into the podcast and to our blog and stuff that are just starting out. So what advice would you give them as somebody starting out in historical fiction?
I would say that as long as you follow basic structure and grammar rules, don't worry about all the rules that are out there created by other authors and bloggers. I see bloggers pick up on this quote from Stephen King all the time that says, "The road to hell is paved with adverbs." I think he actually wrote that, directed it himself.
Probably.
Honestly, because I use this pro editing software to run it through before I send it to the editor, and it allows you to compare your work to another author's.
Yes.
When I run it through, he totally overuses adverbs. So
maybe he was making fun of himself.
I think he was talking about how he got himself into trouble one time by doing that, but
probably so. Well, that's really good advice. So is there anything any advice that was given to you early on that has helped you along your journey?
Well, it wasn't so much early on, but in the process of writing, I'd asked Libby Grant to come to our Southern California Historical Novel Society meeting. It was a Zoom meeting at the time. And I heard her mention this here, and then at some point later, she mentioned it again about how really self-publishing can really be a way to go, and really think twice before you submit your stuff to agents and publishers, because she's had some good situations, but for the most part, the situations she had with agents and publishers didn't go that well. Right. And, unless a publisher offers substantial marketing in the contract with you, the book's not likely to sell millions or maybe even thousands of books.
Very true. Very true.
At least with self-publishing, you may not have big numbers, but you're making a much bigger percentage of the sale.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And it kind of gives you control. I remember feeling that same way because I went through a tragedy myself early, about 8 years ago, and it felt like I don't know. I just felt like it gave me the power back to be able to do that for my own books. Gave me some
Yeah,
power back. I couldn't control the tragedy, but it did
right.
give me some kind of power. So I completely agree with you. It's not something. I know a lot of people shun it and are like, no, 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 don't do that. But I totally agree with you. I think it is absolutely a good option
Well,
for authors.
I've been talking to some of the other authors, and your company actually now offers so many
Yes,
great resources and services for
yes,
self-published authors that
right.
it's just taken it to a whole new level for
Yeah,
people.
and that's what we're striving to do because I've had so many such great support in this community. The historical fiction community is by far so great. So
Yeah.
it's like I wanted to pay back to offer something that, you know, could cover a wide range where somebody could just go, to one spot and be able to find these different services. So thank you. Thank you for
Well,
that.
you're welcome. And I totally utilize them. So
Yeah. Well, we love hearing about your early days of your writing. So is there anything that you ever read that has impacted your life as a writer?
yeah, I didn't read historical fiction until I was a young adult. I was in my mid-20s, and my cousin gave me a copy of The Crimson Chalice by Victor Canning. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but
Mm.
it's another take on the Arthurian story, but it
Oh,
incorporated such history that I had never known about. Like it had all the stuff about the Romans and everything
mhm.
incorporated in it, and just really it helped me a lot because as much as I loved history, I never had any idea that I could learn so much of it from fiction.
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I'm
yeah,
the same way. I'm a sucker for Arthurian legend books too. So I'm gonna have to look that one up.
yeah. It's an
Add it
old
to my
one, but
add it to my list.
yeah.
So, do you have a favorite quote or saying that you live by as an author or as a person?
Well, probably I would say more as a person, and this is you'll see this come up with Amelia, my character. She says this kind of stuff a lot, but that our words have the power to influence our own lives and the lives of others around us. So I always say, choose your words wisely. So that's kind
Yeah.
of
Well, that's a very good saying to live by. Absolutely. Well, tell us, Jules, do you have anything coming up? What's the next in the series?
yeah, I'm working. I'm about halfway through the draft of the second book in the series about Jean BonDurant. Um, and it is going to be a continuation with both Jean and Amelia.
Mhm.
And the working title is Find Me in the Stars.
Oh, oh, that's
Um,
lovely.
yeah. And if all goes well, I plan to release it in January of
Oh,
2024. So,
great, great. So be sure to send us all of that information so we can post it on the website because we'll
okay,
definitely do a featured spotlight for you whenever you have your launch.
sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any events coming up or anything that we should know
Well,
about?
nothing so much coming up. I just did a book signing up in Oakland, California
Okay.
on Friday.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
yeah, and there is another podcast that was just published last week too. That's on journeys into genealogy. So it's
Oh,
um,
fascinating.
a young woman named Emma Cox who's in the UK who
Uh-huh.
does genealogical research for people, and she specializes in research on Huguenots. So she had asked me to sign on for her podcast, and
Oh,
yeah,
that's great. Well, maybe we could have like a backlink to that and let her know that that link on our website as well. And
okay,
it's the more exposure for an author that's great. That's great that you got
yeah.
to do that. That was right up your alley.
Yeah, it was great. We found each other actually on a Huguenot Facebook page.
Okay, well that's
So,
great.
yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much for being on the show today, Jules. We really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, Dee. And it's nice
Yeah,
to meet you face to face.
I know, face to face finally. We wish you so much success on the series. And as always, for more information on Jules' books, you can click on the link in the description or go to her website at juleslarimore.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, as next week's episode features author Love Lubker our newest signed author with Historian Press, and her featured book, Under His Spell, which talks about Queen Victoria's daughter. Thank you to our listeners and viewers. This is Dee Marley, and as always, keep making history and keep listening.